Welcome to Chapter 6, Behavioral Modeling. In Chapter 4, we learned about functional modeling. This is where we identified the functionality, the features, the business processes of a system. We modeled those from a user perspective, a black box from outside the system. In Chapter 5, we moved into structural modeling, where we identified the structure or the framework or the foundations of a system based upon classes. And within the classes, we identified the attributes and operations of each one of the individual classes that had the potential to make up the system. We modeled that from a static view as we took a look at the individual classes. In Chapter 6, we're going to move on to a behavioral model. And this is where we're going to identify the dynamic aspects, the internal logic of the process. So behavioral models show how the objects work together to collaborate or exchange information, the interactivity that occurs between the objects that make up a system. And so we need a little bit of a definition. We define the classes in Chapter 5, and an object is an instance or an instantiation of a class. And so an instance of a class, we'll call an object, is also made up of attributes and operations. And a behavioral model shows how these objects interact with or collaborate or pass messages back and forth between one another. There are three tools that we're going to use to model behavioral functionality within the system. The first tool is called a sequence diagram. The second one is called a communication diagram. And the third tool is called a behavioral state machine. So let's start with a sequence diagram. First of all, we need to identify a use case that we would like to model. And so if you turn in your book to page 159, Chapter 4, Figure 4-4, we're going to look at a figure that is under the business process identification with use cases and use case diagram section. And we're going to look at the appointment system. Remember the medical appointment system that we've been talking about? At the top of this use case diagram, there is a use case called Manage Appointments. And inheriting from that are two additional use cases, a Make Older Patient Appointment and a Make Newer Patient Appointment. And we are going to model, from a dynamic behavioral point of view, a use case that we will call Make Patient Appointment. And we're going to model that in Microsoft Visio using a sequence diagram. So if you turn in your book to Chapter 6, Figure 6-2, under the interaction diagram section, you are going to see the components or the parts that make up a sequence diagram. A sequence diagram has actors and objects. So there are actors who are going to be interacting with the system, and then there are objects, instances of the class, that are going to be interacting with one another as well. So the first component of a sequence diagram are the actions, the actors, and the objects. The next one is the lifeline. A sequence diagram shows the progression of communication over time, starting with the beginning of the scenario till the final end of that particular scenario. And so there is a lifeline and an execution occurrence. That is when each one of the objects are interacting with one another. And then finally we have messages. These are the communications or the interactions or the messages that are being passed back and forth between objects. And then finally we have a frame which defines the boundary of the entire system. So let's turn to Microsoft Visio. We're going to start a new drawing. We want to look for a sequence diagram which we might find under Software. A sequence diagram is going to be made up of actors and objects and timelines, so it will look something like this. So let's go back quickly to the textbook, and we are going to model, from a behavioral standpoint, a use case called Make Patient Appointment. And in order to do that, one of the first things that we need to identify are who are the actors that would be interacting with a use case called Make Patient Appointment. One of the symbols is going to be an actor lifeline. If you're in Visio 2012, 2013. There's going to be the symbol of an actor above a box that is above a long lifeline. And so I would say that in a use case called Make Patient Appointment, there are going to be two actors involved. There is going to be a patient and there will be a receptionist. And so I'm going to drag two actor lifelines onto my diagram. Then I would also be able to identify some of the objects that would make up the system. I could identify instances of a class. I would drag, I could identify three of them. The first one would be a patient. Because when an actor, as a patient, walks into the receptionist and says, I would like to make an appointment, she is going to check for that patient in the system. And so she is going to look for an instance of that patient in the system. We will call it an object. She is also probably going to check to see if there is some kind of an outstanding balance. So she might also be checking with an instance of, say, an unpaid bill or a balance. And then the last one is the patient wants to make an appointment. So there's going to be an object or an instance of an object in the system that might be related to a single appointment. So I'm going to drag these 5 elements onto my diagram, and then I'm going to zoom in because we want to be able to label each one of these. So I'm going to double click on the first one, and I'm going to say that this is a patient. The second one is the receptionist. So I'll double click on the box and I will label this one receptionist. I'm going to expand this a little bit so it makes it easier to read. The next 3 are going to be objects, instances of a class. And in order to identify those, I'm going to click on it. I'm going to give this instance of a class a name. And then I'm going to use a colon, and I'm going to label the class that this is an instance of. So I probably have a class called patient, and I am looking for one instance of that class. The second one is going to be a class called unpaid bills or balance or something like that. And we're going to search for unpaid bills for this particular patient. And the last one is an appointment. There is probably going to be an appointment class that we are going to be searching for in order to be able to make an appointment for this particular patient. So once I've identified what each one of these 3 objects are, the next thing that I'm going to do is we are going to identify the communication or the messages, the interaction that is occurring between each of these objects. And this sequence diagram is a progression of time. And so the top of the lifeline is an earlier point in time, and then as we move through time, we would progress vertically down the lifeline. And so if you'll notice there are a number of different types of messages as icons on the shape navigation or the shape bar. We are going to select a message. So I want to make sure I'm on my home tab. I want to select the connector tool, and then I am going to click on a message. And then I can drag messages from the patient to the receptionist. This first message is going to be where the patient comes into the receptionist and he requests, I would like to make an appointment. So if I click on this, I can indicate what the message is. Let's say, for instance, request appointment. And it is an operation that a patient is going to execute. And so I'm going to put the parentheses, I'll zoom in on it so we can see what it is. I'm going to put the parentheses after the name of the action or the communication that is occurring to indicate that this is an operation. So the patient is going to request an appointment of the receptionist, but he is also going to pass several parameters during that communication, perhaps his name and address. The receptionist is going to initiate a communication between herself and the system, and so she is going to see if there is an instance of an object in the system called with that patient's name. And so I'll click on this, and we'll say she is going to look up the patient. And she will probably pass several parameters during that communication. there is going to be a return message from the system that is going to indicate whether or not the patient exists or not. And so this time I'm going to select the type of transaction or type of communication that is a dashed line called return message. I'm going to double click on this. And there's going to be some kind of a return message indicating whether or not the patient exists. The next kind of communication that is going to occur is a message. And this message is going to go between the receptionist and the class called unpaid bills. And she is going to see if the patient has, or she's going to look up the bills. But there is going to be a guard condition, also known as an if condition. And if the patient exists, then she is going to look up unpaid bills. This particular operation is only going to be executed if the patient exists. That is called a guard condition. You think of it as an if statement. I'm going to use the square brackets to indicate that this is a guard condition. And I'm going to say if patient exists, that is the guard condition, then I am going to look up the bills. This is an operation, so I'll make sure I have the parentheses there. There will be a return statement indicating whether or not a bill exists for the patient, and so I could put the return statement here. And the response on that would be bill or no bill, balance or no balance. That response is going to come back from the receptionist. Regardless of that response, the receptionist is next going to have another communication with the patient, so I'm going to indicate, and I need to make this a message, not a return statement, so I'll delete that one. I'll click on the message. There's going to be a message that is sent from the receptionist to the patient. Notice that the direction of the arrow is pointing, and this she is going to say, do you want to make, change, or delete an existing appointment? So, that is going to be an operation. I'll indicate that with the parentheses. There's going to be a return response from the patient, and because this is the make appointment use case that we are modeling here, the response to that is going to be make appointment. Then, once the patient has responded, the next communication is going to be, I'll make sure I click on message, the next is going to be the appointment times, the date and time of the appointment. So I might say date and time of appointment. And the patient is going to respond with a given date and time. So that would be an answer. I'll double click on this. And the patient is going to respond with a date and time. Now that the receptionist has the requested date and time for the appointment, the next thing that she is going to do is she is going to now communicate with the appointment class. And I will select the message communication. And there is now going to be a communication between the receptionist and the appointment class. So I'm going to draw a message line between the two, and then I'm going to click on here to indicate match appointment. Probably with the date and the time that the client or the patient has given to her. And then there is going to be a return message back from the appointment class to the receptionist indicating whether or not that particular date and time are available. Now, if the appointment time is not available, these series of communications are going to occur over and over again until we eventually do match an available time. And once we do, then the message is going to be sent from the receptionist back to the appointment class to create the appointment with the given date and time. And then, once the appointment has been created, there is going to be a final return message that comes back from the receptionist to the patient indicating that the appointment has been made, and so we could call it confirm appointment. And it is a return message to the original message that was sent up here called request appointment. This is the final return message saying, I am confirming the appointment that you are making. As I mentioned earlier, if the appointment is not, if the originally requested date and time is not available, this date and time appointment could be run several times, multiple times. This match appointment is still not available, she's going to request it again. One of the ways that we can indicate the fact that this operation or that this message could be occurring multiple times is by putting an asterisk in front of it. I'm also going to put an asterisk in front of this operation or this message to indicate that these can be run multiple times. Requesting a date and time, looking for a match can be run multiple times, and I do that by putting the asterisk in front of it. So several things that I want you to notice about this sequence diagram. First of all is that it is occurring over time. A sequence diagram is occurring over time. And so I started at the top left-hand side with the trigger, the starting point and the trigger for this particular use case. And then as I was moving horizontally across the top, I tried to put the actors and objects in the order that they were going to be taking place, or the order that they're going to be appearing in our scenario. And then from top to bottom, this is a passage of time, from the very first communication that occurs down to the final communication that occurs. The next thing that I need to add to this diagram is what is called an activation. Your book refers to it as an execution occurrence. This is a visual way for me to be able to quickly identify when these particular actors and objects are interacting with the system. And so I am going to drag an activation line for my patient. My patient begins his interaction with the system at the very first request, and then I'm going to drag this all the way down to when his interaction ends. I'm going to drag an activation line for the receptionist, and I'm going to drag that down to indicate that the receptionist is interacting with the system throughout each one of these time frames. And then I will drag an activation line on for the patient, and then I will move it up to indicate that this is really the only time that this instance of the patient is interacting with the system. I will do the same for the unpaid bill, and then I will also do the same down here for the appointment object. And so this is a way that I can quickly and easily determine when each one of these actors and objects are interacting with the system. We're going to do another one so we can indicate, or we can notice a couple more things. So let me add another one. This time we're going to create a sequence diagram for, if you remember the children who are going on a field trip and they need a lunch, and there are several parents who are tasked with making the lunch. One to take the sandwich and the other items and assemble the lunch which will be given to the child. So based upon this scenario, which I would call make lunch, there are probably going to be 3 actors. So I'm going to drag 3 actors. The first one will be the child who wants a lunch. The second one is going to be the parent who makes the sandwich. And the third one is going to be the parent who takes the sandwich and all of the other items and assembles a lunch. So I am going to zoom in on these, and I'm going to add titles to each one of these so we know who they are. So this first actor is going to be a child. Probably an instance of a child class. And then I will... The second one is going to be one instance of a parent class. Perhaps we'll call it first parent. It is an instance of a parent class. The next one is going to be another instance of a parent class, which we will call second parent, and it is also an instance of a parent class. Once I have done that, I'm going to use my pointer tool to drag these to a larger size so I can read them. Make it a little bit more readable. And my spelling leaves a lot to be desired. There we go. Let me correct the spelling so I don't have to look at my poor spelling. Now I have three actors. I have a child, I have two parents. Each of the two parents are objects of the parent class. The child is also an object of a child class because there is a field trip that is occurring. So there are messages that are occurring between these three actors. So I'm going to select the message. I'll make sure I'll go up to the Home tab. I will select the connector tool, and then I will select a message. The first message that is going to occur as a part of this particular use case called Make Lunch is going to be a child who is asking a parent to make lunch for them. So I will indicate on this line the message that is occurring. So there is a message being passed between the child and the first parent. The first parent then sends a message to the second parent to create a lunch. And then we're going to see that a parent, an instance of an object, has the ability to call a message or send a message to itself. If you're in Visio 2013, you're going to have a message called self message. If I select on that, I can drag a message from one object to itself. This is when an instance of an instance would run or execute its own operation, and this would be called create sandwich. So the first parent is then going to call its operation, which forces it to create a sandwich. The second parent is then going to send a message to the first parent saying, I need you to give me the sandwich that you just created. So this might be called get sandwich. The response or the return message from the first parent, I'm going to make sure I select return message back to the second parent, is going to be, all right, I will give you the sandwich. Then the response back from the second parent to the first parent is going to be, and it is a return message because the first parent asked them to create the lunch. The second parent is now responding by returning the lunch. And then finally, there is going to be one final return message from the first parent to the child because the child requested a lunch. The lunch was returned from the second parent to the first parent, and so now we see that the lunch is going to be returned from the first parent to the child. So another thing that I would say about sequence diagrams is that the return messages are optional. If your sequence diagram is getting very convoluted and full of lines going one direction and another, you can always omit the return statements. We are going to assume the return statements. If the second parent is requesting from the first parent, give me the sandwich, we can assume that the parent is going to return the sandwich to them. So the return statements are optional if your sequence diagram is getting pretty convoluted. All right, so the next thing that we need to do is add the activation. And so the child is going to be involved in this process from the time they make the request to the time that they receive their lunch. The first parent is going to be involved in this process from the time that they receive that request to the time that they send the final response. The third parent is going to be a part of this diagram from the moment that they receive their first request until the time that they send their final response. And the last component of a diagram is the boundary, a sequence diagram. I would want to put a boundary on it. And so I noticed in Visio 2012 that there is no frame, and so there are a number of different frames that I can use. I can grab this frame. I'm going to drop it onto the screen, and then I am going to move it. Let me make sure that I am on my pointer tool. I can move it to encompass my entire diagram, and then I can double click on the name, and we can give it a name. This is the Make Lunch use case that we are diagramming here. And then I can delete the parameters, And if I am concerned about how pretty this looks, the last thing that I can do with my pointer tool is I can shorten the lifelines of each one of these actors and objects that are taking place or that are participating in this particular communication. I can reduce or increase the length of their lifelines so that it all fits within the frame or the boundary that I have created. Try it one final time. There we go. And so I have a nice, beautiful diagram, a sequence diagram that shows me the interaction that is occurring between the objects and the actors within a time frame. Now, if you'll notice, my activation is sitting over top of the arrowheads. So one of the things that I can do if I am concerned about actually being able to view it, if I right-click on an activation, one of the icons in the top window is called Send to Back. Now, it's not so obvious that I am sending the activation line to the back behind the arrows because they are all the exact same color. But if you choose to make the arrows and the lines a different color than your activation line, it is going to be obvious now that I can see the arrowheads over top of the activation. So this is a sequence diagram. The next thing that we'll be talking about are communication diagrams and behavioral state machines.